Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Taxter, Barnett and Annalie Newman Curator of Contemporary Art at the Jewish Museum. I'm pleased to welcome you to this conversation, Calls to Action, Museums, Art, and Achieving Equity, held in conjunction with Lawrence Weiner's installation, All the Stars in the Sky Have the Same Face. For Lawrence, language is a universal material that allows a vast and diverse audience to connect to his artwork. When we began thinking about programming for his exhibition, we wanted to explore the potential of this or any artwork to act as a catalyst for civic action. How can art and art institutions join the challenge to create a more equitable world? We convened this panel of activists, cultural theorists, and artists to discuss the impact of this public artwork and the role museums play in achieving equity. You will hear from Dr. Mijal Bitton, scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and co-founder of the Downtown Minyan. Uzodinma Iweala, award-winning writer, filmmaker, medical doctor, and CEO of the Africa Center. Baseera Khan, New York-based visual artist, and Yehudah Webster, community organizer for Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Now it's my pleasure to invite moderator Kendal Henry, Director of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs Percent for Art program, to begin the conversation. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. I know some of you know me. I don't know others, but welcome to this conversation about Lawrence Weiner's work on the facade of the Jewish Museum. And my name is Kendal Henry. You know, I always like to hear people's own version of themselves and what they want people to know of themselves. And, you know, in sort of the context of what this year has been, you know, it's been quite an interesting year and has been a unique year with all that's going on in the world. In that context, I would like to hear what it is that you do and how that has evolved, changed, how the year has inspired what you sort of, how you think of what you do and how important that is. To start that conversation. And, you know, Baseera, you're the artist there. I want to hear from you first.
So the first thing that I felt was relief in a way, because I had been taken all over places all the time, being shoveled from one place to the next, to have to then like be the voice of my work. And I was actually experiencing a lot of fatigue. And so though the pandemic is horrible and everything that has come after that is horrible, I have experienced rest that I haven't had in a while. And so, you know, I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today about Lawrence Weiner, because within the public space, you're always, especially if you're like a Black or brown body, a female body, you're always having to go through modes of translation. With the way you dress, with the way you stand, with the work that you put out. And so I'm pretty excited about having this conversation. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I look forward to those conversations as well. Yehudah, what's been going on with you?
Peace, everybody. You know, again, just as a means of introduction, I'm Yehudah. I use he, him pronouns. I'm with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice as a community organizer. And after the police murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and a spate of other racist incidents that were captured on video, many Black organizers, including myself and folks at large in the movement, we were reminded of something very important, that there has been a pandemic raging for 400 years, the pandemic of white supremacy and racism, and that our survival is dependent just as much on protesting, being in the streets, having our voices heard, as it is with wearing masks, social distancing, and hunkering down to survive this coronavirus pandemic. And I was in the streets fighting throughout the summer, and there was even a moment where I was out there for 40 days of action in a row. And it was powerful, and I will never forget it.
Wow, that's looking forward to hearing more of that. Mijal?
Yeah, hi, Kendal. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. My name is Mijal Bitton. I'm an Argentinian Jew of Middle Eastern Sephardic descent. In terms of my profession, I am a sociologist. I studied a Syrian Sephardic Jewish community in New York, and I'm very interested in trying to understand immigrant communities, try to explore and study different moral frameworks that reflect different genealogies of ideas and peoples and movements. I serve as a scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I'm also a faith leader. I co-founded a Minyan, that's like a praying community in Hebrew, and I lead that in Lower Manhattan. And I guess a lot of my life is at the intersection of many different communities that have different ideologies, different political stances, different understandings of God and of meaning. And I enjoy trying to figure out how to translate between different parts of my life and what it means to live in the very rich, complex, and messy place of listening to multiple voices and multiple viewpoints. In terms of the pandemic, a lot of what was said, I really relate to it in terms of having a little bit of a pause button, also in terms of really thinking about questions of racial injustice and what it means for us to stand up at this moment. And, you know, I've been thinking about those things. I also have 2 little kids, so that's been like a whole other layer of trying to, to get through this pandemic. And I've also been thinking a lot about our democracy, you know, our political life. What does it mean to look forward? What does it mean to stand for liberal democracy? How do we build bridges to make sure that we have the, you know, enough votes to go in the right direction in this country? And what does it mean to have moral courage at this particular point in time? So I guess I'm bringing all these different aspects of this conversation and very much excited to discuss Lawrence Weiner's artwork.
I'm getting a sense of activism in everything that everybody's doing, which will be interesting to see how that plays within the conversation. Uzo, share with us what you've been up to.
Well, hi, so I'm Uzodinma Iweala, but people call me Uzo. I'm the CEO of the Africa Center just up the street from the Jewish Museum, right at the top of Central Park on the east side. And you know, so that's what I call my day job. I've got I suppose calling, I don't know, like what I was doing before that. I write books, make films, and I have a little bit of a side hustle at NYU teaching creative writing as well. It's been a difficult time. I found it very difficult to create in this moment because of everything that's going on. And that sense of instability or precarity is interesting because I'm supposed to be writing an essay collection around the idea of vulnerability, but we're just not going to tell my editor about
that. Thanks, Uzo. So from my perspective, what I do is I commission public art with the sole goal of giving voice to artists, particularly in communities that one doesn't hear from very often, and using those artworks as a sort of a catalyst to amplify some of the different perspectives within whatever conversation comes through those artworks. And so when I was asked to be part of this conversation, I was very excited to see the work and then, you know, understand through the lens of a commissioner of this kind of work and what one hopes that would happen as a result of experiencing the work. Some of you are artists on here. Some of you experience artwork in very different ways. We have different religions here and different, you know, backgrounds and all that. And so it would be very interesting to see or hear how you interpret the work that we're going to be talking about today and what comes up as a result of some of those interpretations. And so I don't know how many of you have actually seen it in person yet, but I'm sure you see many images, and I'm going to share my screen with some of the images here. to sort of, refresh your visual memory of the work. I actually went to see it a couple of times. Last time was yesterday, and I approached it from the south, passing Guggenheim Museum, passing the Cooper Hewitt, which is a couple of blocks away, and just looking at it as a thing on a building, not necessarily a work of art, which of course it is. And it sort of looks out of place. It's a banner on what is a historic building that used to be a mansion that is now the Jewish Museum. And many people who see it may not understand that that's the Jewish Museum back there, may not understand that it's art. It is, obviously it's doing a bit of a peekaboo with the trees there. So to sort of read it, you kind of have to do a little bit of a dance to sort of get what it's saying. If you're an English speaker, you kind of get sort of the bottom interpretation there. And then, so the Arabic and the Hebrew writing to you might be, a hidden secret that you may not understand what it's saying because you don't know the language. And the way it's rendered on the canvas, it sort of, evokes brushstrokes or, in a blue sky, clouds. It is red, white, and blue, which again evokes some of the colors. And they're talking about me here. That's associated with the United States. Though the colors themselves, the hues of those colors aren't exact, particularly in the blue. And so you look at it and you wonder what's going on here. And using sort of the visual language of how we read things, it's a billboard style artwork on a building. It again looks disjointed. And then you read the words. It's sort of in a safe space in this location to me, right? It is not in up the street in Harlem, which probably would give a different reading right off the back. It's not in the city community, which probably would give a slightly different read if you saw it there. It's there on Museum Mile, where to some extent people expect to be in a particular mind frame to understand what it is that you're looking at. So in understanding what this work is from my perspective, and I'm very interested in hearing from what you think that this means as a conversation starter. All the stars in the sky have the same face. And I know, Mijal in particular, you sort of dug a little deeper into the different interpretations of this, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. But I also want to hear from others. What does this conjure up? And we have this idea that if it's in writing, if it's big, then it must be true. And we sort of use that vernacular in our world today. We have 8 gigantic Black Lives Matter murals throughout the city. And we say it because we want it to be true. We want it to sort of evoke the power of truth. And so this is doing that as well. So I'm going to open up the floor here. And I want to start with you, Mijal, to get your interpretation, because you did a little bit of research on this. What is this saying? What does it say to you?
Sure, thank you. What the artist was doing here is take an Yiddish idiom that said, and I'm not going to say the Yiddish, I'll read the English translation, all Greeks have the same face. And really what this meant to convey, and it was said historically a long time ago by Jews in Europe, is that all non-Jews are the same. And it's being said in Yiddish. Yiddish is a Jewish language. So it's a language in which if you use it, you're usually trying to talk to other Jews. And it was said in a context of really high anti-Semitism. So much of European Jewish history is one in which Jews are the other, and they're a persecuted minority. And this is the language or the cry of an oppressed group in which they turn to each other and they're like, all those, they're all the same, all those who hate us, all those non-Jews. And what Lawrence Weiner does here actually is fairly audacious and fairly political. And I would love help actually thinking about it, because from my understanding, he actually, in a bunch of different ways, he transforms and universalizes this message, right? He takes this expression of Jewish pain that says all the non-Jews hate us, they're all the same, and basically says something very optimistic, right? All the stars in the sky have the same face, which I take it to mean all of humanity is similar. Maybe in the most positive reading, we're all good, in a very dark reading, we're all bad, but in that case, it's also us, right? So there's something very universalizing about that. The other way in which he's universalizing it is that he's not saying this in Yiddish, that internal language inside the European Jewish community, the Ashkenazi one, that was spoken back then, but he's translating this to English, to Hebrew, to Arabic. Again, I'm also curious why he chose Hebrew and Arabic here, and I was wondering if he's hinting to the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So there's something really fascinating that's going on here. And I'll say one more thing as to why I'm thinking about this. In Pesach, in Passover, traditional Jews who celebrate Passover, Pesach, read the Haggadah. And one of the things that we say, and it's not unproblematic, but we say it. One of the things that we say is, B'chol dor v'dor omdim alenu lechalotenu. In every generation, they stood up against us to destroy us. And that reflects this extremely pessimistic Jewish reading of history that basically says we're always going to be othered in some way, and we're always going to have to experience or witness anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish persecution. And I'm trying to think, as someone who says those words in Pesach, in Passover, I'm trying to think about this mural and about the different messages embedded in this. And I see in it so much. I see in it potentially a critique of that pessimism and saying, actually, there could be other worlds, other countries, maybe America, other places in which the Jewish experience is not that negative, not that terrible. I could also see in it something very optimistic and hopeful, saying the world keeps evolving and actually, you know, we can find a place in which old hatreds go away. And I also see in this something that tries to take deep historical Jewish pain and use it to make contemporary statements about liberatory intersectional movements. So there's something here about saying, let's take the experience of Jewish suffering, let's transform it, and let's figure out what tools do we get from this to face down oppression in our own time and place, whatever that oppression looks like. So I'm thinking about all of these issues and a lot of really intriguing and important questions. And I'm curious to see what other people get from this.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to you next, Yehudah, because you sort of have the added, experience of being a Black man in the Jewish community. And so how does this sort of read to you?
Really appreciate Mijal's perspective on this. And I'll start by saying, I certainly appreciate what I believe the artist Lawrence Weiner is trying to convey here, that we are all equal, that we all bleed red. And I can't help but think that perhaps that's why the English letters are in red, that maybe the artist is trying to convey and further cement in this idea that we all bleed red. At the heart of it, we're all the same. That said, I also can't help but think quite critically of the blind spots of this statement, given that the reality of our time is that white supremacy has reshaped our perceptions and our lived experiences in such a way that despite us all having the same components of a face, eyes, nose, mouth, cheeks, chin, right? The value of our lives have been placed into a hierarchy of value on the differences of skin color. And so if this is a question that the artist is posing to the community, as I'm learning and understanding is Lawrence Weiner's way, if this is a question, then my answer is a resounding no. We don't all have the same faces in America. We sadly don't even all shine brightly due to oppressive systems like white supremacy, racism, racialized capitalism. And it's because of these oppressive systems that we don't shine brightly, and instead they drain our life and our light like a black hole in space, leaving only a few of us to be able to rise up and shine, even though truly we all are stars, right? So I think it's aspirational. I could rock with that it's maybe perhaps provoking the societal duty that we all should be obligated to correct this exploitative imbalance of racism and white supremacy, and to allow each person to really uncover the stars within themselves, eradicating these oppressive systems that really dim our lights from ever really shining brightly. it's something that we're working towards, and I can't help but name some of the blind spots that I see from just stating all the stars in the sky have the same face.
So you were going to go there with, because that's sort of the core of these types of conversations. Now I want to hear from the artists. Baseera, what is the responsibility of this work as a public artwork, and how do you sort of read it? And I'm going to take it off screen for a while so I could actually see all your faces.
Thank you for everything everyone's said so far. The Museum Mile is a really particular place, so I can start with that because I'm going to be thinking about this as though I made it. So I think that my ambitions of growing up wanting to visit all those museums and look at all the work and at times even want to touch the art, I then came to New York City, and that's how I arrived here in 2007. I bought a one-way ticket and I came here, and I finally was able to walk up and down the Museum Mile. Although it is a public space and it's a space of history and canon building, it's a white space. The houses are locked off. The service workers are always Black or Arab, Mexican, you know, like whoever they are people that are traditionally seen as non-American. And so, you know, walking up and down these blocks, I start to think of some of the things that Yehudah is saying, which is like, this translation is tone deaf. It's a little tone deaf because I mean, I think that Lawrence Weiner is an amazing artist, and I'm glad that this work exists. But in this particular moment, even a work that could translate in a different way, in a different generation or a different year, it at this moment with everything that is going on, it's very tone deaf. I'm thinking about how before we were talking about the universalizing of this, right? So how is that any different than saying all lives matter? And so, you know, there's a major discourse here about, no, what Black Lives Matter doesn't mean it's excluding other lives. It just means that Black people have been excluded. So we're just trying to voice that opinion, and that opinion has to be voiced without us having to include everyone else, right? So this kind of reverses that all the posters and all the paint on the streets where it says Black Lives Matter, because you have this banner, this artwork in one of the most premier locations in the world for arts and culture, not just arts and culture, but commerce. So that's my first kind of thought process about that. I personally, as an artist, wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dare to do it. Lastly, you know, there's this quote, and it says, "I'm as good as you are." And I've done like a series of works with that quote, and that quote comes from Emmett Till. And purportedly, these are the last words of Emmett Till as he was being bludgeoned to death. And so, you know, it's just like there are other ways where words are very powerful. And I guess my closing remark is that in this instance, I do feel that there are many people that live and walk the streets of New York City who voted for Trump. And when they look up and they read that, they're like, yeah, I matter, right? And that's not, that message is messy. And as an artist, someone who comes from my perspective, I really have to think about all those things and sometimes just not make.
Is there value in having an artwork that stimulate these kinds of conversations, that this is not the time to have these conversations? Is there value in that? Is there value in this work bringing up these conversations? That's my question to you.
There's always value in art. This project and Lawrence Weiner's presence in the art world is very important. it just is what it is. You know, the installation happened, it's present. And so at best, we have intellectual thinkers that come together and have really important conversations, such as this. But, you know, over COVID, over this pandemic period, I was asked to do a group exhibition at the New Orleans Museum of Art to show Braid Rage, which is like a climbing system that I do, and making a film. And then there was like a national boycott of the museum because they had decided to reinstall a plantation in their museum and collect it. Then there's also, you know, all these monuments that are simply, people just want them to be displaced. At times they don't even want them to be destroyed. They just want to take them out of the city center and place them someplace else, right? And so the question always is, isn't it or is it? I mean, the presence is there anyway, even if you remove it. And conversations are important. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
I appreciate a lot that Baseera is raising here. And I think that, you know, as Baseera already pointed out, words are very powerful. And I think about the unconscious conditioning that art and media at large does and continues to do to us. I think about it like a war of airtime. We're waging a war of indirect and direct messaging. And the more that we have messaging that talks about things like all lives matter, as Baseera kind of raised, and universalizes the specificities of oppressive suffering and our experiences, our lived experiences in this reshaped world of white supremacy. It diminishes the hard work of activists and organizers striving to actually establish that Black lives matter, that other lives outside of whiteness really matter. And I think that we have to be very careful in what messaging we put out. And I really think that artists have a huge role to play in this, a huge role to play in this when I'm talking about this war of airtime, because from the time that you're a little kid, the scales have been tipped to white supremacy through the histories that we learn, the picture books that we read, the media and TV that we consume. I mean, it's why, you know, many studies have been found over the decades that find that young Black girls already have internalized the messaging that white is prettier, that white is somehow ultimately better. And so when you put out a group of dolls of different races before these young Black girls, they continuously choose the white doll as the prettiest doll, even though there's a doll that looks much more like them right next to them, right? And it's because of this war of airtime that we continuously lose, right? That is pushing the messaging that white is best. So I think there's value in artwork, and I'm glad that this piece is provoking this very critical conversation. And I'm also aware, as I think Baseera was already mentioning, that, you know, many people walking by that are going to internalize the wrong messages. It's only going to further solidify the ideas of white supremacy that we're working so hard to dismantle.
Okay. So Uz, I'm going to come to you now. You mentioned in your introduction that on the facade or within the windows of the Africa Center, there is this huge Black Lives Matter statement. And, you know, I imagine, you know, as Baseera sort of illustrated, you're walking down Museum Mile, and at the top part of Museum Mile is the Africa Center. And as you walk down, you know, quite a few blocks, you cross over, you see that, you cross over El Museo, Museum of the City of New York. You're making statements. You chose these words to make this particular statement. And so how do you interpret this, and how does that speak to what you're doing in your space, and what is that conversation?
Sure. I mean, I think all of the folks who are on the panel have already sort of made some very astute comments about the messaging and the sort of the complexity of interpreting a message of this nature. I will just add to that by talking first about the coverage, right? So I don't know if you guys have seen, but there's a Wall Street Journal article about the installation. And I'll admit that maybe I'm a little bit salty in the sense that, the article talks about this installation, which is pretty spectacular, and it is complicated, but it then goes on to speak about how museums in the city are sort of turning the walls inside out and like displaying stuff on the outside. But notice that it actually doesn't mention any essentially non-white institutions, right? As if, for example, we don't exist up the street and we don't have a message that is being displayed for people. And I think that's they quote folks from the Met, from the Brooklyn Public Library, from the Brooklyn Museum, what I would call legacy institutions, and don't think about the fact that there has been a flurry of activity and expression that, for want of a better term, I'll say non-sort of legacy or established institutions have been taking during this period of time. And I think what's interesting also is that I think some of these older institutions or more established or more moneyed institutions have been doing this in a way that sometimes feels like it's more of and I want to be careful and respectful of the folks who are pushing this at these institutions, but also I think we need to acknowledge the fact that, these institutions have for the longest time felt like they don't owe anybody anything, and they don't owe anybody, they're just fine, essentially, and that they can keep going the way that they've been going as essentially what I would call mausoleums. But basically where these institutions have basically felt like they don't need to they're not necessarily accountable to the public for the specific issues around race and how we perceive ourselves as members of this country that we live in this society that is very much unequal, that has always been unequal, and that is in many ways committed to inequality. And I find that, in the coverage, you get that same dynamic, and that just perpetuates this notion that some voices are more important than others. And, as Yehudah, you were saying, some ideas are more important than others. And Baseera, I think you were saying this as well, right? This idea of speaking to, in some senses, a lack of care in the phrasing, but also the idea that some phrasing is more appealing to certain people because it absolves people of the hard work that comes with reckoning with the idea that the inequality is not a bug, but actually a feature of the system. So that's just to start. And I think then, I think about it in terms of like why we put the message that we put up on the side of our building, which is, twofolds. One, I think you go back to this idea that it's painful to even have to utter the words that Black Lives Matter, because it's so obvious. And you almost wonder whether you're doing yourself and others a disservice by stating that. But at the same time, one of the things that you learn when you're learning or when you're teaching is that repetition is absolutely important and key. And if somebody can't digest a simple concept, then you just kind of have to keep hitting them with it over and over and over again until that concept is part of their sort of like the fabric of their existence. And I think that's what some of these murals are actually about. It's the recognition and the repetition that eventually drums into people's existence that this is a thing. I think when it comes to the actual message, I won't say very much more except to say I think the points that have been raised about a push to a universality at a moment where it's clear where it's clear that there is a strong contingent of people who do not want to recognize sort of the universal humanness of us all. and are very vocal about that. Number one, and number two, where there's another very strong contingent of people who would recognize our universal humanness without then acknowledging the constant and consistent push to dehumanize people is a bit of a problem. And it is, as a discussion starter, if it raises this discussion, is a wonderful thing. If it doesn't, and it allows people to move by and feel good that, like, yes, it's an affirmation of a fundamental equality, and I affirm as well, but in my statement, in my word, but I don't affirm in my practice or my daily life, then we have a problem. And I think you can read it either way. I would like to read it in the sense that it pushes people to examine whether or not we are actually whether we are living up to this idea. But I also think that with these messages, especially messages around universalism, that's usually not the case, and especially not in this country, and therefore we do have a problem. All the same, I would say it's a bold statement. And I think if anything that is forcing institutions that on Museum Mile, or that operate within this cultural space, that again traditionally has been very conservative in the way that it approaches things, to step out and say, okay, we are going to think about a different use of our facilities. We're going to think about a different use of the buildings. We're going to think about what it means in terms of the audience that we intend to speak to, and the audiences that sort of the unsuspecting or unsuspected audiences. I think that's progress, and that's a benefit to everyone, especially if it stirs up debate, as this I hope does. That said, it's slow, and I think we're in need for a radical reimagining of what these institutions do and how they make meaning. And that's not just because I think it's what we're trying to do at the Africa Center. I think that's also just because I don't think that these institutions, mine included, survive without that radical reimagining. Certainly the ones that have huge endowments will move along, but you'll find a younger audience, you'll find a sort of an audience that's hungry for a reckoning and for a dealing with the complicated nature of what it means to collect, display art objects, cultural objects, etc. We'll turn to other areas and avenues for that discussion and analysis. And that you see that happening, and it will accelerate the less these institutions, sort of like the more these institutions focus on token steps and not real sort of radical reimaginings of what it means to be to be in this space. And that's kind of how I think about it.
So I'm going to be a little devil's advocate here for a little bit. And we're going to talk about the words some more, but and then move on to something else. But the words are in English, in Arabic, and in Hebrew. And the words are being sort of put out there by the Jewish Museum. And, we all know how, Jewish people have experienced a lot of sort of oppression and anti-Semitism and all that. So do they get a little bit of a pass, perhaps? And do you think that this should be looked at slightly differently than what you're thinking of, because it's coming from the Jewish Museum, or it's coming from these different voices and this different perspective, or no? Anybody?
I'm just going to jump on, and I want to just go back to what Baseera said, which is, I think that it doesn't matter like what institution puts it out. I think every institution has an obligation to like really think about, what is on display. That's, especially given the moment, like, we don't exist outside of the cultural presence. We don't exist outside of the political presence. And we certainly don't exist outside, no one exists outside of the news cycle and whatever sort of, mass communication tools we have. And so I think that makes it important that wherever you are, whatever cultural group you represent and whatever cultural institution you represent, like you owe it to yourself as an institution, and also to sort of like what I'll call your main sort of constituents, and then the wider public, to be very thoughtful and careful about the messages that you put on. And so I don't think it's an ethnic group or a religious group or a cultural group specific thing. I think it is very much about, institutionally, like, how are you thinking about where you sit within the political moment? And that's a responsibility that we all bear, and that I think we all have to take very, very seriously.
I was just going to quickly say that on university campuses, they carefully curate artists to visit campus, and they oftentimes look at the social issues of the times so that the artists can be interpreters of the time, because essentially you have students that are growing and learning about art, and oftentimes the professors that are stationed have been there for a long time, and for better or worse maybe aren't as active, so they bring in younger artists and adjuncting and all, visiting artists and all that. So it's important to say that, because on these campuses you have diversity officers. They're people that are kind of like policing staff, faculty, and students to make sure that everyone's equitable. I don't think that museums have that. I'm not sure, but I've worked with enough institutions, museum institutions. I don't know that the board members and the senior staff curators are really asking the appropriate questions, because honestly, the Whitney Museum has made some tremendous asinine moves through COVID as well. And I'm not saying that the billboard that the Lawrence Weiner is asinine. I'm just saying that it doesn't operate as art. It operates as a message, as a code for people who are unassuming. They don't maybe not even see that it's a museum. They're just reading this message. And I guess, my main critique is that it absolves people of their actions. All the messaging that goes around that's to make you feel good, and colors of Benetton or situation, these messages absolve people of their wrongdoing. And there's a lot of wrongdoing. 70 million people voted for Trump. And a lot of those people are in New York City because he's from New York City.
So I'll add something here, and maybe I'll join the devil's advocate side and bring some additional perspective to this conversation. Let me say two things. The first is, I might be one of those unassuming people, because I'm just being very frank. I don't know much about art. I don't know much about museums. And when I first came across this mural, and I am fairly politically aware, so, but I actually didn't think that it was trying to say all lives matter. Like, it doesn't even cross my mind. I was trying to figure out, what is it saying about stars? What is it saying about all people? Why are there the three languages? So I'm just saying, I'm not, as someone who's not maybe as literate in the art world, maybe as one of those people who are supposed to get different messages, I didn't read a specific message. I was more intrigued, oh, interesting, and still thinking about it. So that's just one perspective from a passerby. And then the second perspective, and this is where I might have, I think, different opinions. I would identify as a classic liberal, in the sense that I would never want there to be equity and diversity officers in a museum of art, trying to kind of, I want art to be provocative. I want literature to be provocative. I want to find, not that I'm saying this is, but I'm saying I want to have the sort of robust conversations in which there are different messages and robust messages out there, and in which we argue and we try to tease things out, and we have to persuade people of moral positions. So I don't know, I guess, and this might also be that I'm not in the art world, so I'm not, I haven't thought enough about the intersection of the political and the artistic, as maybe you have, the rest of you have. But I think that there's a lot of reasons as to why it might be interesting to have art in which the messages are ambiguous, in which people can argue over different things, and in which people of different stripes can come to really ask big and difficult questions, because we're moved in very different ways depending on where we come from and what our experience is, what our cultural literacy is, and things like that. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
So I just want to, sorry, can I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, we're at a table having a conversation. Go ahead.
I mean, I think a couple of things. One is I firmly agree with you in the sense that you don't, like, you know, for example, as a writer, you know, I get asked the question a lot, like, what do you mean? Like, what message are you trying to push in your writing? And I'm like, you know, that the idea is behind any work is that you're supposed to have multiple interpretations. It's why we all like to look at paintings, or why, you know, like when somebody reads a novel, you can have that discussion and sit down and debate for hours what happened. I do think that there's something very different about the sort of idea of diversity and inclusion, why that's necessary. And you know, I think people often jump to this thing that it's trying to stifle or push a particular perspective. And the truth is that, you know, the way that I see it, and that I think a lot of us interpret it, is that it's more because, like, otherwise these institutions would completely lock out a certain set of voices, and there wouldn't be the perspective, there wouldn't be additional perspectives. Like, I think what is very clear when you look at it across the board, whether you're talking about it within the cultural institution specifically, or if you look at, for example, the reports now, like from, you know, like I think it was one private equity firm today that came out and said that, you know, there are less than X number of Black professionals within the private equity space. Another report the other day said there are, believe it or not, there are less than 300, I'm a physician by training, right? Like, there are less than 300 Black men who become doctors each year. You go to another space, you look at consulting, right? Another report was just released and they say there are less than 5% of people who are people of color or Black people. And I have problems with the people of color term, but Black people who are consultants. What it means is that these spaces actually have there is no actual perspective, additional perspective or alternative perspective within this discussion. I'll go back to something, you know, else that someone sent me, kind of a funny little tweet that someone sent to me, which was someone saying something about how there are, you know, people talk about diversity hires, and how this guy is saying that he wants to bring the term homogeneity hire into existence, because of this idea that, like, you know, oh, well, so Mike hired another Mike, you know, who's white like him. Oh, that's clearly a homogeneity hire. And I say this just, you know, jokingly, but also just to set up the idea that, like, without those, it's a rough, you know, it's like a sledgehammer to a nail, but like to hang up a picture. But without that, you actually lack the diversity of voices necessary to have even a discussion about this. So you could get an ambiguous statement like the artwork we're speaking about, and have so many people actually agree that, like, yes, this is a wonderfully affirming universal message, without the perspective of somebody who comes in and says, actually, you know what, this is, and again, I think if you looking at the history of Lawrence Weiner, like, you and his activism and his sort of support of Black causes and whatnot, I'm not saying that this is it, but I think you can very well have people walk down the street and not privilege the perspective of someone who says, but, you know, actually this makes me think that this guy is trying to whitewash the struggle, or actually, you know, this doesn't speak to kind of the unrest and the instability and the precarity that we have experienced, because it doesn't acknowledge that in its statement. And that's to say that it's a beautiful thing for it to inspire the debate, but it's not necessarily clear that without somebody asking that question, that it will do that. And that's the tension and the push and pull that I think we all feel. You know, it's you know, the counterpart is, like, for us to put up Black Lives Matter on our building and to have somebody walk down the street and say, but what about all lives matter? I welcome that, actually, to be honest with you, because it gives us a chance. But the truth is, like, one, if you don't put up the artwork, right, then people won't ask the question, number one. So you're not stifling any debate or causing any sort of like censorship in that sense. But at the same time, what you then get is, as soon as people saying, you know, across the country, we're saying Black Lives Matter, you then have a majority perspective of all lives matter, that if not for these folk, and if not for, you know, people actually giving space to these folk, that all lives matter would just wash over everything, and we wouldn't even have a discussion about what that means. So I think it's important for that to exist, and it's important for the tension to exist, and it's important for a statement that seems ambiguous to be challenged in the many ways that it should, as a good and provocative piece of art.
I could just quickly also build on what Uzo was saying. I think art and various other expressions communicate directly and indirectly who is welcomed in a space, who is welcomed within a community. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a building and I've peeped the artwork that's on the wall and immediately known, oh no, I'm not actually really welcomed here. This is not a safe space or even a brave space for Black people. Or how many times I've, gone up, upstate trying to get a weekend away, and I find myself in like a white majority, like something crazy, like 98% white town. And we finally, my girlfriend who's Korean, we finally come across a Black Lives Matter lawn sign, and we breathe a sigh of relief, like, ooh, we got some allies up in this town. Like if something goes down, we're not alone, right? And I think it's just really important. I just felt compelled to name that, the cliche that with great power comes great responsibility. And if you're an establishment institution, you have that power and you need to wield it very respectfully. And whether we're in an uprising moment or not, these last 400 years have been framed by white supremacy. And so we always need to be pushing the envelope to true equity and in everything that we do.
I just want to say a few things. Hopefully I can be as articulate as possible. I completely agree with you, Michaela. I think that art should never be censored. It should never be restricted. And even the most offensive works can be very interesting and create immensely important dialogue. But what I meant by this kind of like imaginary diversity officer within the campus of museum spaces or mausoleums, as Ozo said, is that artists are a couple of things. They are usually the only person in the room not getting paid, but they are the origin of thought, right? So these spaces wouldn't exist without the work that the artists do. Just like universities wouldn't exist without the intellectual property that you bring them. So it's not a question of Lawrence Weiner. It's a question of time and trend, right? And so there are a lot of magazines like Art Forum magazine or journal, or, you opening up the New York Times every single day, you have like Derek Forager, you have like, Art Forum now, it's like every single artist in Art Forum now is a person of color, right? This was a switch. This did not happen like 5 years ago. But, and all of that is technically really great, right? Because you have all of these new voices that aren't necessarily new, are they? They were just let into the gates were open for them now. I'm a great example. Like I have been working and doing the same thing for a very long time. And now I get to like enter into the room and do my thing as an artist. Well, with that space and that airtime comes the artist themselves is put in a very precarious situation, because yes, as an artist, I want to share my work. I want to do my work. And oftentimes I want to be left alone to do my work. And Lawrence Weiner talks about this all the time. He's like, I have a set of questions. A lot of the times I'm working in isolation. And a lot of times, like I can't even speak to other people because I'm in this kind of like pattern of confusion, which is a good thing for an artist. Now you're in a museum space, and most of the people that are hired to be in museum spaces or cultural producers have never, ever even like thought about a person of color. And in most cases, with the Whitney, for example, they're all men. And they don't have to deal with women or femme identifying bodies. They don't have to do any of it. And so what happens is young Black artists, young South Asian artists, young queer artists, young Indigenous artists, a la carte, they get picked up because they're a direct pipeline to Wall Street. And all of that can yield positive and negative results. But what happens is sometimes these artists get put into precarious situations without the infrastructure. Because, you know, when you are in any other profession, there's infrastructure. But in the art world, it's the Wild West. And so I think that there should be, if museums, if galleries want to represent bodies of color, then they must also have to go through diversity training. And I think that that needs to be an industry standard. It's happening with every other place. You want to be a lawyer, you have to do diversity training. You want to work at Parsons and be a professor, you have to do diversity training. So why can't that be an industry standard for museum, art galleries, public installations?
Well, I mean, I'm learning so much right now. A lot of what you're saying is like totally new for me. So I really hope that artists get paid. You said something about that, and I'm upset about that. But that's a different conversation. I think that in general, when I think about art, and I also think here about literature and about films, I still believe that it's really important to kind of have unrestrained creativity and conversation. And I'm kind of anxious about how that works out in combination with this sort of like a diversity training for art. And I'm saying it as somebody who's not in that world, you know, just from where I'm sitting. But I want to share with you, if it's okay, something from my own research that can explain the place that I come from. Because let me just give you a totally different set of ideals and morals and questions around ethics. So I'm somebody who comes from a very socially conservative background. I come from a Middle Eastern Sephardic Jewish community, fairly patriarchal gender roles, fairly specific assumptions around gender and all of that. And as you know, as I grew up, I encountered and adopted a lot of feminist ideals. And wanted to figure out, okay, how do I resist some of the things that I grew up with in terms of the limitations of what I could do as a woman, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to give you an example of the sort of research that challenged me and that I still think is really important. So I came across, when I was way younger, starting off my PhD at NYU, I came across the works of the great Saba Mahmoud, who sadly she passed away way too young. And she was an anthropologist of women in Egypt, pietist woman who took on the veil. She was a student of Talal Asad. And one of the magnificent interventions that she does in the scholarship of feminism, sorry if I'm going all over the place right now.
No, not at all.
No, this is great.
Okay,
great. I read some Saba Mahmoud in graduate school.
Oh, she's, I mean, I really mourned her passing. I was like, we need more works. But she does this incredibly provocative scholarship in which she basically takes Western feminism and says, and I'm going to say it in my own words, I'm not quoting exactly, but she says something like this. She says, Western feminism is predicated on equality, on actually having men and women kind of have certain equal behaviors. And she wants to study women in Egypt to put on the veil. And she wants to reconceptualize feminism, not on equal outcomes in terms of gender, but actually on agency. She says, I want to understand why there are women who take on more restrictive, quote unquote, patriarchal, sexist, misogynist practices. And she actually demands that we take a step back from our sort of like Western assumptions as to what the world should look like, examine the genealogies of ideas that we have around liberalism, human entity, the good life, etc. Like really asks big existential questions, and then says, let's examine agency of women who, according to Western feminism, are acting in the worst ways. And to me, this was amazing, and it was complicated. I'm being told here that I need to actually conceptualize feminism, for example, looking at its Western dimensions, right? That when I look at my Middle Eastern family members who've made different choices than mine, I can't just say, oh, you know, I can't just examine them through my Western eyes, and I have to actually ask myself big questions about agency. And that work, if I only operated with the values of a sort of like Western feminism, I would say we need to censor this work, because it's actually leading to the sort of lifestyle that maybe I I stepped away from and that I found liberation from. But at the same time, even while it challenges me, I have found her work so amazing and so important, because I get to have a less American-centric sort of point of view. I get to look at the world around me. I get to communicate. So again, I am more in that world in terms of cultural and social anthropology than I am in the world of art. So I'm not saying that I'm missing some of the ways that this is translated, but I know that I have. Yeah.
I think I'm getting misinterpreted in general, because I'm talking about programming. I'm not talking about censorship. I'm talking like these kinds of, like, first of all, I'm a mental hijabi. Like, I grew up in a very, we call ourselves mental hijabis. We're always wearing a hijab, but you know, I'm not wearing a hijab. It's in the head. It's an ideology. And I also grew up in a very conservative, like, Muslim family. We opened one of the first mosques in Texas. You know, it's like, it's a big deal. And like, just to be present and be like, I was as outrageous as I am is political, and it's a big deal for me. But I think I'm getting misinterpreted, because my whole like concept of this kind of diversity training, diversity hire has nothing to do with the artists. It has to do with the thinkers and the programmers in the departments of cultural arts, right? It's like, we could have like put up, okay, let's just say we could have put up Lawrence Weiner's banner in February of 2021, and it would have been, for me, I would have had a completely different feeling about it. But the fact that we're on the rise again with COVID, the fact that people aren't receiving their unemployment checks, the fact that the year is ending, the fact that people can't see their families, the fact that, like, all of these people that have money get to have in-home lick tests so they can do all the things they want to do. And then art is always attached to economy and culture and money producing, and all of that is connected to imperial patriarchy. That is why I feel like there is always poor planning in programming at museums. I'm 100% on your side when it comes to make the work as offensive as you possibly can, because art is the origin of thought. And even the most offensive work produces amazing conversations. We've seen that with the Whitney Biennial of a couple of past, right? With the Dana Schutz piece. And like, there was that was another programming situation, right? The idea of the Black spectacle happening where, you know, police officers were shooting people, and there was like, absolutely, it went from like, I shot and killed this man, to the next day they're eating a donut and still getting paid for their work, right? These police officers. That was the time when Dana Schutz decided, oh, I'm a white mother and I want to say something, so let me paint Emmett Till's open casket. And then somebody in the museum decided to think that that was a good idea to put in the Whitney Biennial, right? And so this isn't like, Dana Schutz should do whatever Dana Schutz should do. You know, like, don't censor her. But the programming is awful. It's always deaf, tone deaf, right? Because what was happening that summer, the Emmett Till case opened. So if anyone just like pulled their head out of their ass, so to speak, to see what was going on around them, they would know this is not correct. We shouldn't put this painting in this exhibition. That's what I mean. It's like, it's always a programming issue with these museums and these universities, honestly.
Just to jump in on that, I think, you know, again, also to stress the importance of free expression as like as a need in a society that considers itself free. But I think going back to the idea of whether or not we live in a free society, and I think it's a really important thing to think through. You know, again, like, Baseera, what you said is 100% right. People should be able to do whatever they want, like paint whatever they want, write whatever they want. You know, for example, I taught in my course this year, I taught the Turner Diaries, which, if you haven't interacted with that, is possibly one of the most hateful, anti-Black, anti-Semitic texts, like anti-LGBTQ. It's anti-everything that is not white male. And, you know, the question came up, why are we reading this? And I was like, well, let's think about it. It's important. Like, this person should be able to write what they want. We should also understand that when this thing comes out, that this has influenced the way that many people think. It's like a really strongly affirmed text amongst militia communities, white supremacist communities, and it has actually driven a lot of dialogue and discourse in the mainstream, right? So you kind of ignore its existence at your own peril, and you can engage with it how you want. You can engage with it as somebody who loves the text, if that's your orientation. You can engage with it as somebody who's highly critical of the text and offended by the text. But you have to engage with it. There is not necessarily a safe space for you to exist without these ideas and sentiments around. And I don't necessarily think there should be. I think you should have physical safety, and I think you should have some kind of emotionally supportive space. But I think at the same time, that doesn't mean that the world is not trying to harm you as a person. And I think we all come from communities that have had to deal with a world that is absolutely trying to harm us in so many ways. And I think, we just have to say that. But I do think, again, I just want to stress this idea about who has been de facto censored, right? Who has been de facto kept out of conversations just by the way that institutions are arranged. I think is so important for our discussion, right? And so are you really then sort of living up to the liberal idea, the idea of real freedom of expression and freedom of interaction and discussion, if just baseline your institution has been put together to exclude, has been put together to at first purposefully exclude a certain set of people because, within the whole entirety of Western philosophy, history, artistic expression, these people have either not been people or have existed outside of the realm of what is considered sophisticated and even sort of like human, like what has been considered human expression. And to understand this, I think you have to just go back to the roots of all of the underpinnings of the philosophical underpinnings of liberal Western thought, right? And read Kant, read Hegel, read Hume, read all of these guys. And invariably in any of these sections, when they refer to Africa or Blackness or Black bodies, we are specifically referred to as not human or subhuman. Therefore, we are not even invited to be part of this debate or dialogue that exists within sort of the idea of Western liberalism. And I think a lot of people forget that within the sort of that the foundation, and that's why I say it's a feature, not a bug, to exclude certain voices, is that the foundations of this sort of universalist thinking of Western thought and society are actually not universalist at all. I think you can even go up to folks like Hannah Arendt and her complicated understandings of the civil rights movement to suggest that even the people that we most admire when they speak about some of the human or anti-universalist things still have blind spots, as we all do. And I think that's why it's incumbent upon us as individuals and also as institutions, right? And I think this is the individual thing again. Say what you want, dress how you want, behave how you want, paint what you want, write what you want. But the institutional responsibility in a society that has very much benefited from the dehumanization of a certain set of individuals, and that is, not even kicking and screaming, that is just has basically declared itself anti that humanization even to today, right, is a really important and difficult thing to discuss, but needs to be discussed. And these institutions need to lead the way. It can't be you can't assume that a very flawed understanding of or philosophical underpinning for your sort of cultural community's existence or your political existence will allow for the discussions that you want, the open discussions that you want. You have to go the extra mile. And I think that's the point that's being made. And so you then start to judge, or at least I will judge, whether it's works of art or how institutions display works of arts or, organize themselves based upon whether or not they have that as a fundamental understanding of, and you can't get to that fundamental understanding if you don't have people within the space who are ready and willing to question the underpinnings of even the makeup or the structure of that institution. And so again, it goes back to what does diversity mean to these institutions, right all the way up to having Lawrence Weiner's exhibition on the wall. What does that then project to, or on the facade of the building, what does that project to folks who are walking by or interacting with the exhibition? And is it contextualized in a way that allows for you to understand sort of Weiner's history of activism and his relationship to Black communities, Black bodies, etc., you know, his Jewishness and his like interpretation of his own faith and his own cultural and ethnic traditions, and you know, like, and then also what that means in this present political moment. And you know, that's a lot for, you know, like, that's a lot for an artwork to do when it's standing on the side of a building. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be on the side of the building. It should be there. It does mean, though, that in the contextualization of that artwork, that needs to be front and center, because I don't think we have a society that's set up to prompt people to do that work. In fact, we have a society that's set up to disincentivize people from doing that work. And that's where the tension comes in.
I'm going to interject here because I want to respect people's time, but I also wanted to address what Uzo and quite a few of you have been talking about in the last few minutes. And Yehudah, you mentioned, like, with great power comes great responsibility. And the work is out there. It's being viewed. We're having a discussion about it, which I think is actually part of the work itself. What is the responsibility now of the institution to the work and to the audience and to the public and to the dialogue that's happening around this work? What should the museum be doing? The floor is open.
I think, you know, this is a good start. This is a great, I mean, this is a good place to begin. And this is kind of one of the things that we did around the Black Lives Matter installation that we have. And, you know, it's what we've tried to continue to do with the programs that we have done, for example, in front of the installation that we have at our space. I think, you know, again, people do need to be in a sense in this place. I think we have to just admit to ourselves that people have to be dragged into a debate and an understanding of this particular installation, but also of all of the ways in which institutions display the artwork that is up and the choices that they make. So I think opening, as an institution, opening oneself up to this kind of level of debate, potential criticism, is a very good first step, but I think one has to continue it. It can't be like, oh, we did this discussion, therefore, you know, like, we've done our bit. It has to be a constant conversation around the impact and the importance, and also the problems that such an installation may bring up.
I'll just say that I share that, and I'll take myself as an example. I just learned so much. And I feel like this was so great to kind of raise my consciousness and awareness of some questions that I wasn't even asking when I was looking at it. So I think that it's a great, I think that if it is, like was just said, at the beginning of a conversation, then it's great.
Baseera, I'm going to ask you.
I think that common practices should exist, where you invite artists from different backgrounds. You invite the artists themselves to speak. You know, there's so many different, like, multimedia platforms that you can share discussions. You know, we should do all of this before the internet censors itself, because apparently that could always happen, to where there are no more comments. I mean, the world of, like, sharing and avataring doesn't exist anymore. That could just happen tomorrow. So yeah, that's where I'm at. And, you know, being invited into this conversation, I was actually kind of like, what? Look at these people's portfolios. Like, they're brilliant. They're like PhDs. They've done all this stuff. And no, I have done a lot of stuff, but, like, I don't get to do as much research and reading as I'd like to do, because I'm always kind of having to work with materials. But you know, this is so cool for me, because I am going to be working on 2 public installations, you know, here in the next year to 2 years. And, you know, having these kinds of conversations in museums, opening up space for people to come together and have conversations, just allow for someone like myself to have more agency. So sometimes it's not even about directly addressing the artwork itself, but it's about, like, extending a form of agency for those that come into the conversation.
I'm very much appreciating this. I think I agree with Uzo that this is a great beginning for the institution to welcome, you know, various folks within the community to talk and think and discuss and debate the significance of this art piece. I also think it's incumbent on the institution to empower the community to riff off of this artwork, to add to what Lawrence Weiner has done, to produce maybe alternative and responses to said artwork, right? I think about how the institution could work to empower and lift up the voices that are too often marginalized and never get a stage like the facade of a building.
And as I predicted, I have learned quite a bit today. And I want to thank you, Mijal, Uzo, Baseera, Yehudah, for sharing your time and your perspective and your knowledge and everything that it is that the great things that you do here. And I just want to say thank you for that. And I know the Jewish Museum probably thanks you as well. And this is what the artwork was meant to do, pretty much. So engage in these conversations, not necessarily to come up with solutions, but to sort of put out there, what the issues are, and hopefully at some point find a way to at least, resolve it or come to some sort of understanding. And so I want to just personally thank you. This is a big part of my education as someone who does artwork in the public on a regular basis. So yes, I learned quite a bit. So thank you.